I have been told to start my videos with a hook. Here it goes. Perfectionism. If you stick around, by the end of this, you'll understand why I'm a perfectionist isn't a useful diagnosis. You'll learn how to identify the rule underneath it that's constraining your creative freedom, and I'll show you the two-layer approach I use to fix it. I recently finished composing a work for Bansuri and orchestra. Bansuri is the Indian bamboo flute. The subject matter draws elements and characters from my Indian culture. And as I was composing this, my life was metaphorically aligning with the story of the work itself. It got extremely personal. I quit my job to focus completely on it, and it took over 2 years to complete it, way longer than I expected. Looking back, I got extremely precious about this work, and understandably so because it got so personal. I was selective about who I would share it with in the development stages, and even when I did, I felt the need to preamble it with disclaimers like, oh, the MIDI sounds bad, it will sound much better with real musicians. This section isn't finalized yet, and all that jargon. That preciousness also showed up in the form of me avoiding composition sessions, me refusing to finalize sections, and spending an embarrassing amount of time before I called anything done. I thought I was a perfectionist, and if that kind of perfectionism shows up in your work, then it probably looks something like this. You compose toward an imagined audience rather than the music itself, so the decisions you're making are dictated by how the music will be received rather than what the piece needs. You avoid sharing work because you cannot control who hears it and how they respond to it. You release less work than you make. You take substantially more amount of time than required to finish the piece. You feel deflated by one negative response in a sea of positive ones. And you spend more time justifying the work before people hear it than you actually spend making it. I did some further research into perfectionism, and there were two types that were relevant to this situation. One is driven by your own standards. You hold yourself at an impossibly high bar and struggle to let go when you don't meet it. The other is driven by your perceived expectations from others. So you're not just trying to meet your own standards, but you're also trying to meet the standards that you have constructed in other people's heads. And both were at play in my situation. But calling myself a perfectionist didn't actually help with anything. Perfectionism was more like a behavior that was kept in place by something which was deeper. So whenever I approach a limiting creative trait, I look underneath the label and figure out the internalized rule that I'm operating under. So in this case, I'm a perfectionist I have fused my self-worth with whether I meet my own standards or whether my music is being perceived the way I need it to be. That's a much more useful thing to work with. And also, after you identify the rule, you can also figure out where else it is showing up in your creative practice. Needless to say, I had to change that. That's no way of living. I'm not suggesting that this is the root of all perfectionism. I'm saying that this was something that was working underneath mine. And if you are experiencing similar symptoms to what I have described before, then it is likely that this is also the root underneath yours. I came across a very apt analogy of how to approach perfectionism, and I want you to keep on thinking about composition as I explain this. Earlier this year, I started making pour-overs. Pour-over is, as the name suggests, a way to make coffee by pouring hot water over a bed of freshly ground coffee beans. The beans that are used for this are specially roasted and fermented and infused with a whole lot of notes. So you control the variables and optimize the degree of sweetness, sourness, smokiness, nuttiness, etc. based on what you like. And boy, there are so many variables. Just to name a few, the water temperature, the coffee to water ratio, the grind size, the pouring pattern, the time of extraction, and so much more I can't even explain. Looking past the sheer pompousness associated with making coffee in such a way, I see it as a hobby and I see it as a positive event of my day. I love hosting my friends and making them try different beans and recipes. And I have made pour-overs for friends who take espresso shots daily in lieu of antidepressants, and I have made pour-overs for friends who, when asked to drink coffee, they put so much cream and sugar you would think that they are descendants of Winnie the Pooh. The way they receive a single cup of coffee is wildly different. Recently, I made a cup of coffee and it was so bad, I cringed every time I took a sip. I shared it with my friend and she thought it was the best pour over I made for her. Even after I told her, it tastes like blasphemy. Even though I clock which one of my friends like what kind of coffee, I always optimize the taste of the coffee depending on what I like. As I experiment and create a space where my friends can openly like or dislike the coffee I make, I never seem to be bothered by how it is received. The amount of effort I put into optimizing the coffee to my taste is irrelevant if my friends will like it. The amount of effort I put into optimizing the coffee to my taste is irrelevant if I will like it. As I'm approaching this experimentally, when I make a pour over that I dislike, I immediately think about what variables that I can change to optimize it further. I learn new stuff, I change the variables, I reiterate, I make shit coffee, I do it again. What I don't do is I learn new stuff, I change the variables, I worry about how the coffee will be received, I don't make coffee. Stalemate. The pour over just exists. People receive it however they receive it. My self-worth was never supposed to be associated with any of it, including my own opinion. The same is true of the music. If you have attached your self-worth with the music you make, let's fix that. We will address this at a cognitive layer and then follow it up with an actionable layer to cement the fix. This is where the work gets super personalized, so make sure you're questioning what I'm saying and you're assessing it for yourself and for your situation. At the cognitive layer, we will reframe the internalized rule as a permission that we can give it to ourselves. So, I have fused my self-worth with whether I meet my own standards or whether my music is perceived the way I need it to be, becomes I need to decouple my self-worth with how my music is received by me or by anyone else. This is not equivalent of, oh, you're homeless, just buy a house. By reframing the internalized rule as a permission that you can give to yourself, introduces agency in your line of thinking. It opens the possibility of overcoming it by something that you can do. If your trait resides within accessible psychological realm, and if you are convinced that you need to give yourself this permission, and if you're willing to put in the effort to be conscious about this permission throughout your creative practice, then it'll do wonders. But if your trait resides deeper within your brain, something that will help you in giving yourself that permission is an actionable step. What I would advocate for is an experimental mindset. A Stanford psychologist, Carol Dweck, points out that mindsets can and do change. Like habits, mindsets are practiced. This is how you go about it. First, define the function of what the piece is about. What is it that you're trying to do, trying to achieve, trying to feel, trying to express, anything. Then you hypothesize how you will achieve that. Then you execute and produce. Then you collect data from yourself and from others, whether you were able to achieve that function or not. And then you reiterate based on what the data tells you about the function. Suppose I'm writing a section for a hybrid cross-cultural electroacoustic chamber ensemble. And the section needs sort of this dreamlike haziness quality to it. I'm going to hypothesize that I will need to divide the ensemble into two parts. The first part plays the actual notes, and the second part plays the resonance of those notes. I'm going to crank up the resonance so much so that it's kind of drowning the actual notes and creating this dreamlike quality. This is still a hypothesis. What I will do is I'll go ahead with that. I will see what the product is like. I'll assess it for myself. I'll take data points from other people, whether I achieve the function or not, and then maybe change the variables and reiterate again. There is no question over here whether the music was good or not. The only question is that whether I achieved the function I set out to achieve, and whether I was curious enough in the process. When you implement both of these layers together, the cognitive and the actionable layer, something shifts. You make decisions based on what the piece is requiring rather than what an imaginary audience requires. You share work at the rate you make it, and you don't hold it until it feels safe to share. One negative response lands as just a single data point in a plethora of data points, and you don't attach your self-worth to it. And you're more willing to finish the work because you're genuinely curious about whether the variables you chose actually led to achieving the function of the piece. If this resonated, I work with a handful of composers privately whose music, like mine, doesn't follow any single tradition or discipline. If you're not ready for that, I'm also building and curating a community of such composers. It's a space to talk about creative problems and possibilities that comes forth by working across traditions and disciplines. We're launching in September, but you can request access right now. There's a link in my description. Check it out.
Welcome to my YouTube channel.